Hi, my name is Dr. Marci Littlefield, and today I want to talk to you about early immigrant issues and who can be American. The reality is that the United States has never been a land that did not discriminate. There was always a context for who could be American and who had the rights to be American. Right after the American Revolution, the Naturalization Act of 1790 made it clear that those who were allowed to be American in this country had to be, one, free and white. They had to reside in the United States for 2 years. They had to reside in a state in which she or she applies for a year. They had to satisfy the court that he or she is of good character, and they had to take an oath to support the U.S. Constitution. This Naturalization Act of 1790 was the very first act put in place to ensure that the country only allowed rights to certain groups of people. So when we think about an American society, America has always been a society that has discriminated against groups based on race. There are a number of related Supreme Court cases that also make this point very clear. At the very top is the 1790 Naturalization Act. In 1857, the Dred Scott Act ruled that free blacks were not U.S. citizens. This was before the Civil War, and all of these acts give some context for understanding why race has always been a form of discrimination in the United States, not just against African Americans, but also against Asian Americans. And today we are going to talk a little bit about what that means. If we look at the chart, Chinese Americans were excluded against with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we will talk about in a few minutes. The Dawes Act forced Native Americans to give up their communal ownership of land in 1887. In 1898, the Supreme Court granted citizenship to Asians born in the United States, but by 1917, the Immigration Act created the Asiatic Barred Zone, which included India, Burma, the Malay states, Arabia, and Afghanistan. And between 1922 and 1923, the Supreme Court's case ruled that those who were Asian Americans could not be citizens. And they ruled in the U.S. versus Thing case that whiteness could not be defined by Asian ancestry. So what we see is that citizenship again began to be a context which only defined natural born citizens. Why was that important? Because the United States was most certainly setting up a nation that only certain groups could really be a part and gain, and what the freedoms of what America looked like, despite the understanding that America was supposed to be a place for those who could experience freedom. In fact, that was why the United States was formed, based on those principles, that everyone had the right to liberty and free will. But that's not really what happened in terms of how it played out. This is a picture of Dred Scott. The court ruling in the Dred Scott case ruled that African Americans were not free, and slaves were not considered citizens of the United States and therefore had no right to sue in court, despite the fact that Dred Scott was trying to actually sue for his freedom. And then comes along the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was the very first form of exclusion. Now, slavery was already part of how the United States was formed, but prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was not an act in place that actually excluded who could migrate and immigrate to the United States. There were no borders. There was nothing in place that actually set up rules. Well, the Chinese Exclusion Act did that. It excluded Chinese Americans from becoming citizens of the United States. It barred the Chinese immigration for 10 years, and it prevented the Chinese already in America from actually becoming citizens. So the American Workers Union were worried about losing their jobs, and they were worried that Chinese immigrants would work for less pay and would take away jobs from them. This act was renewed by Congress in 1892, and it was made permanent in 1902. It was not repealed until 1943. What did that mean for the Chinese? They could not, if you were not a citizen, you could not own land, you could not run for public office. So your ability to be able to make it and your ability to be able to make your life better was completely inhibited by this act. The anti-Chinese sentiment really was all over the United States. And again, it was influenced by the white-dominated labor movement. And what it did was it completely barred Chinese Americans from becoming citizens. And this particular act is used in the current immigration debates. Why do people migrate? People migrate because they want a better life for themselves. There are push factors and pull factors. Push factors are factors that push you out of your country. And we've had a lot of immigrants that's happened to because of political unrest, because of religious and ethnic persecution, because of economic difficulties. The United States becomes a place where people want to migrate to. And we also need immigrants here. We need immigrants to work. Perceptions of a better life, the desire to join a community of fellow nationals, chain migration, a lot of things pull people into coming here. So at that point, the Immigration Act of 1924 was developed. This was the very first time that the United States developed an act to say we are going to make sure that only groups come from certain parts of the world. And this was the very first time that we have an Immigration Act which says who can come from what place. So now this America, land of opportunity, prosperity, and freedom was completely defined for only certain groups of people. And this was done by the quota system. So what did the 1924 Act do? It severely restricted immigration, and it came right at the end of the wave of European immigration, which was allowed in previous times, and it established a country-based quota system, and it completely eliminated immigration from Asia. And so that's the important part to think about it. So restricted immigration, when you think about when immigration became restricted in this country, it came between 1882 and 1964 is when we see all the laws and all the things that were passed to make sure that immigration was restricted. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the Alien Contract Act, the establishment of the Bureau of Immigration didn't happen until 1891. The Immigration Act of 1924, which restricted immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then the Alien Registration Act. By 1965, the United States amended some of the Immigration and National Security Act, and it made illegal crossings more difficult and dangerous. And a lot of the unintended consequences of this act were that you had a lot of immigrants who were more likely to establish permanent residence in the United States because of difficulties following the border. What we see is that there's a high amounts of immigration projected to drive growth in the United States through at least 2035. However, we need immigration. Without these new arrivals, the number of immigrants of working age would decline by 17.6 million by 2035, as would the total projected U.S. working age population would fall to 165.6 million. This is according to the Pew Research Center. So when you think about the major immigration acts, again, all of these acts are part of what defined immigration and what changed this whole context and continues to define American society as being one that discriminates against people. And we see that what happens over and over again is that different groups become discriminated against. The Chinese discrimination continues. COVID-19 has really President Donald Trump labeling the COVID as being a Chinese problem has led to a lot of xenophobia for the Chinese.